about, another pretty garden. Um, and in getting into writing it, I saw that I'd spent many years working to preserve gardens, and the gardens that I really care about and have helped preserve are only going to succeed long term if new generations and new people take an interest in those gardens. So I really wanted to address younger people in particular, and to reach out to them and encourage them to take an interest in plants and gardens, and plants and gardens and nature, and the redemptive power of gardens. So that was my hope at the beginning, and I can talk a little bit more about how the book is received, and how actually we could get it into the hands of people who care during this last year. But what I'd like to do with you all tonight is to tell you a little about me, my background, some of the gardens that have inspired me and that I've learned from, some of the nursery people in the nurseries that have influenced me and taught me. And then I'm going to look at some of the guiding principles behind the making of the garden. And it's kind of a sidebar towards the beginning of the book that it's just a series of bullet points and photographs with these principles. So that would be the organizing idea behind this talk. And then we'll take a whirlwind tour through some of the garden areas that maybe I haven't focused on, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So I moved to the Upper Valley of New Hampshire and Vermont in the 1970s after a failed career as a graduate student. And I tried my hand as a cabinet maker, as a community organizer. And one of the things that I discovered was that I really wanted to work outside. I wanted to be outside. I wanted to work with my hands. And I found myself leasing a farm and growing 10 acres of vegetables and selling it through a farm stand and farmer's market and a wholesale route, and being really pleased at the end of that first year when I had netted $5,000. But sometime later, when I was still netting $5,000 at the end of the year and losing weight and just getting a little too tired, I decided it was time to sell the tractor and to move on. And I was really lucky to land on my feet working in a seasonal position, temporary position, at the St. Gaudens National Historic Park, a National Park Service property in Cornish, New Hampshire, here looking at Mount Ascutney in Windsor, Vermont. And I was able to learn about ornamental horticulture and preservation on the ground, working to restore the hedges at the St. Gaudens site. And I learned really the history of this place, and not just the history, but the artistry of this garden and many of the gardens in Cornish. Cornish had been an artist colony beginning in the 1880s that was centered around Augustus St. Gaudens, who was really the leading American sculptor and leading American sculptor of the American Renaissance from the 1880s until his death in 1907. And around him formed many other artists, painters, writers, and gardening became a common pursuit among these artists and their families. And one of the denizens of Cornish is Ellen Shippen, who said that Cornish represented the Renaissance of gardening in America. And I think I knew it at the time, but I've really since come to see just how lucky I was that my introduction to gardening was in the garden of a sculptor, in the garden of an artist who was really working with space and volume and light, and didn't have a lot of money to put into his garden. So he and the neighboring farmers he hired dug white pine and hemlock out of the fields and woods, and created a half-mile series of hedges with these, and paper birch planted, and then the gardens outfitted with old-fashioned colonial revival, really hardy herbaceous perennials. And then looking around at some of the other gardens and working with some of the other garden owners, like the heirs of Charles Platt, whose garden here we see photographed in the early 20th century. And Charles Platt was one of the people who was responsible for introducing a new style of gardens into the United States. He traveled in Italy and photographed and wrote the first book in English on Italian Renaissance gardens. And he learned, he studied these principles, and then he applied them to his own garden and to the dozen gardens that he designed in Cornish, and then in many other gardens throughout the country. But he began as a landscape painter, and he understood the painterly aspects of a garden. And here we see his very formal flower garden close to the house, and then the long view down the Connecticut River Valley with the overlapping hillsides. And then this land here he sculpted to help move the eye from the very formal flower garden down this beautiful expanse of the river valley. And his colleague, Ellen Shipman, who designed many gardens in collaboration with Charles Platt, was gardening in nearby Plainfield, New Hampshire. And she saw that privacy is the most essential attribute of any garden of any type or period. And she was also really masterful in understanding how to relate a garden to the landscape beyond, or to frame a garden with native trees. And then of course she filled those gardens with hardy herbaceous perennials. Then I was given the opportunity to work with the successors of Stephen Parrish's garden, Northcote. Stephen Parrish was a leading etcher in the 1880s. He taught Charles Platt. He was the father of Maxfield Parrish, who took this photograph of Parrish's garden, Northcote, with his niece in the garden. And I learned really from studying his journals, his correspondence with nursery people, about gardening in this climate, and taking an artistic and experimental approach. Parrish was the most experimental and adventurous of all the Cornish gardeners. I'll come back to him in a little while. And then I wanted to expand my wings a little bit and learn about other types of gardening. And I was attracted to gardening at the Fells, an early project of the Garden Conservancy. And this is the garden of Clarence Hay, the son of John Hay, the diplomat. And Clarence Hay had traveled in Italy and France and England like the Cornish colonists, but he wasn't interested in reproducing an Italian view from his garden. He loved the rocky New Hampshire pastures and the dark pines and hemlocks, and created this spectacular nearly acre rock garden on the shores of Lake Sunapee. And he just loved the where he was. He loved the forests of New Hampshire. He loved the native plants, and really worked very hard to make his garden to feel a seamless part of the New Hampshire landscape. And then I was offered a position as director of preservation for the Garden Conservancy. And I got to meet some of the most interesting, exciting, and adventurous and generous gardeners of the 20th century and early 21st century, like people like Ione Chase in her garden out in Washington State with this view of Mount Rainier. And I learned how she and her husband loved camping in the backcountry and hiking on the shoulders of Mount Rainier and wanted to bring those memories home to her garden, but couldn't bring the plants from those higher, colder elevations into a lower, very wet elevation. But she wasn't afraid of using very common plants like ajugas and veronicas and phloxes to create a simulacrum, an alpine scene. And then I've worked with people like George Shelkoff in your backyard at Hollister House, a garden that I have watched go from glory to glory over the last decades, and remain very involved with working with George and Pam Moffett and the board of directors to promote this garden and open it to the public. So enough about background. Here we are, looking straight at a 1830s Greek Revival farmhouse in Norwich, Vermont, Bragg Hill in Norwich, Vermont. My partner, Jim, was offered a job elsewhere. He decided to turn it down. We decided we needed to shake things up and get out of a very dark and cold house in a hollow. And Jim found us this place at the top of Bragg Hill. And part of what was attractive to it was the light in the house. It's tall ceilings. The light in the house is gorgeous. The living room is large enough for his Steinway Grand. And so it's the place we've come to in 1991. So over the years, I've dabbled in learning something about the history. And one of the things I learned was this land was settled by a family from northeastern Connecticut in 1767. And by the middle part of the 19th century, it was a fairly prosperous hillside sheep farm, dairy farm, with all sorts of products so for cash and for sustenance. By the late 19th century, this farm was providing Dartmouth College with its dairy products. And in the 1920s, Robert and Elizabeth Mackenzie, back to the Landers from Somerville, Massachusetts, moved up here to farm. So here is where we are. We're about 3 miles from the town of Norwich, 5 miles to Hanover, New Hampshire, which is just out of the view to the right of this photograph that shows some of the foothills of the White Mountains on the left. The farm had once been maybe 150 acres. We bought 22 acres, 10 of it field, 10 of it forest, and 2 or 3 developed acres around the house. We're at 1,150 feet elevation. The land slopes to the north. It's open to the cold northwest winds, but also summer breezes. The fields are still open. Our fields and many adjoining fields are still open and still hayed. It's good glacial soils, prime Vermont agricultural soils, deep and nearly rock free. We're zone 4B for gardeners. We can go into the -20s. We've seen -28. And then we've also seen in July and August, 95 degrees for a couple of days at a time. Both of those temperatures we experienced here in 2020. So what did we find? We find a house that had been well cared for by the Mackenzies, but never overly restored. They kept a roof on. They kept it painted. But as Betty Mackenzie aged into her 90s, she was less able to get out and to garden, and so the house had been ensnared by roses and brambles. But in pulling those out, what was revealed was the property of a gardener. And Betty Mackenzie had been gardening here from the 1920s well into the 1980s, and many old-fashioned um, shrubs like this beauty bush and Harrison's yellow rose and number of roses and honeysuckles. And then in taking stock of what was here, these wonderful 75-year-old sugar maples and old apple trees and lichen-covered capstones of granite walls, President Lincoln lilac, the state champion, here standing in front of the one remaining barn, and then apple trees by the barn along the roadside, one of the real character defining features of this farmstead. And as I say, Betty was a gardener, and much of her front garden remained. And early on, I made the decision that I was going to clean up and prune and live with and honor and enjoy the garden that Betty McKenzie had made in the front of the house. She had removed whatever she'd grown in a perennial border, and I restocked that with my own perennials, but that's really the only substantive change I've made out front. So the real changes and the real challenges were going to be in the back. And this is the view that made me pause as to whether I really wanted to take this place on. The scale of the landscape, as beautiful and as expansive as the view was, the question was, how was I going to be able to create a garden while having a full-time job, and especially a job that took me away quite a bit? How was I going to make that happen? So here's the story about how that happened. Here's that same view 25 years later, snapped digitally in an August morning in 2017. So the story is really, I'm going to form it around the guiding principles. So I've said that I would keep the front pretty much as is, and that the focus would be on the back, and that I needed to sort of take stock of the challenges of the scale and needing to do some screening. So these principles, some of them were there, they were just sort of part of my soul and my approach to gardening at the beginning, and others have made themselves known to me as I've gone on, and then all condensed in the writing of the book. So it was really important that the garden should feel like a natural outgrowth of the place, and it should harmonize with its vernacular architecture and the agricultural character and history of the place. And it should relate to the topography and the natural features around it. And then the best views, and the views really to focus on and to work with, are to the east, and especially the northeast, as well as the northwest. One of the things about this garden that I've been blessed with, that I just take for granted, but so often I'll come home from visiting other gardens and I'll realize that here the sky is as much a part of the garden as almost anything else. And the sky is something that when it's raining or it's snowing or when you're down weeding, you don't see. So there need to be conscious moments to help raise the eye to the sky. And I've done that with the flower garden too, to direct the eye from the deck to this really quintessential Vermont pastoral view to the northwest, and then working with a less dramatic but very long open view to the pine woods and the hillsides to the north. Then I really wanted to take advantage of the barn foundations. There were 3 barns, and here we see the floor, the footprint of what had been the stable. And then we step up to a concrete slab that had been the floor of the milking parlor. And then beyond that, a 70-foot long hay barn. They were all long gone, collapsed in the 60s, removed in the 70s, but really wanted to work with those. And then I also like this photograph because it's my Ione Chase moment, where I feel that the garden talks to those hillsides, some of those ledgy, rocky hillsides across the river, with the willows and the junipers and the sedges. And then these granite walls also have made themselves known as a great companion for broadleaf, coarse-leafed, herbaceous perennials. And then also as a place to insert saxifrages and other alpines, as Clarence Hay had done in his rock garden at the Fells. So you saw that neighboring house in the first photograph, and we became very good friends with our neighbors, but they were no more interested in knowing what we were watching on what we could see them watching on their TV in their living room window than we were looking at it. So screening became an early and important consideration. And there were a couple of false starts, but something I did was to really take a close look around to see what evergreens, hardy evergreens and deer-resistant evergreens, conifers, could provide the spine of a screening on the property line. So I ended up with Norway spruce. They've not been without their problems, but there they are. And then a landscape architect friend suggested that I take a grid off some of the existing apple trees and plant an orchard. And here we see some McIntosh and Cortland apples that were culled out of an orchard that was downsizing. And that landscape architect friend and I don't think ever imagined just how beautiful a scene these apples would create in May. And then there's a long road frontage. We've got about 300 feet of road frontage. So there's other screening to do. So from early on, screening and privacy from the road became an important consideration. So here we are with this is the end papers of the book, but really I use this to say that after some of those false starts, I decided I really needed to draw the garden to create what I call a master plan. It wasn't really a master plan, it was a sketch for how I would organize the garden. So here we see the long stretch of Bragg Hill Road, dirt road, dusty. The main portion of the house, Betty McKenzie's front yard, an L extension and barn. And then we walk through the L extension to the deck and a porch and look over the vegetable garden and the flower garden, the poplars, and a long open rectangular lawn. And then with the barn foundations above that, the orchard and the spruce off to the right. So this is the garden as it is now, and is pretty much the garden that was or the spatial organization that was envisioned early on in the middle 1990s. So I also thought that that plants would be the primary means of creating structure and interest rather than architecture or garden ornament. Sort of the humbleness of the house didn't tell me that I needed to build brick walls or expensive structures, the wet and the wet soils and frost heaves told me I really shouldn't be investing in walls. So the Lombardy poplars and viburnums and dogwoods as hedges, yews as hedges, and then other deciduous shrubs to help organize space, and then of course the apples. Then I said that the garden really needed to present well from the deck, and that the view would attract the eye and invite exploration, but not give everything away. And then poplars. It was Frank Cabot who convinced me to plant poplars as a intermediary between the garden and the landscape, as they do at his garden at Cochevant in Quebec. And I was predisposed towards poplars, seeing them in all the photographs of the Cornish gardens, but knowing that none of them existed anymore in those gardens. But it was Frank who told me that I would need to top them at 20 years and to reinvigorate them. And that's what you see in this photograph, these line of 7 poplars 2 years after cutting them back at age 20. And then there needed to be a quiet place and a sense of privacy in the back, and a birch grove as at St. Gaudens. And then this is the most private place in the corner of the stable, where I can get away from the road, get away from the house, and get away from the busy, active, colorful parts of the garden. And that I really wanted to accommodate a wide range of hardy woody plants, as well as herbaceous perennials. But I was really interested in learning more about shrubs, and then also in cleaning out some of the brambles around the house. I realized that I was denying birds their habitat. So I needed to reestablish habitat for birds and wildlife closer to the house. And many of these native shrubs have helped with that. And then, of course, I'm a plant collector. And so the garden has got to be a place where I experiment with plants. And I've gone through a number of different phases over the years, beginning with summer blooming phlox, and then willows and rhubarbs and primulas and saxifrages. And in this, I was really aided by some of the great nurseries of the day: Katie's Falls Nursery, Blue Meadow Nursery, Heronswood Nursery, Forest Farm. I was really lucky to be making the garden when I was making it. And then I don't want it to come off as a collector's garden. So I really want to cultivate spaces to feel like garden spaces, but I want to cultivate them to match the needs of the plants, and then to arrange the plants in a way that feels natural and right for this spot. These Mardigan lilies have moved a number of times until I really found the right cultural conditions for them and the right place in the garden. And then I don't want the garden to give the impression of striving for perfection. And I'm really so much interested in foliage and working with foliage for the months of satisfaction that foliage can achieve throughout the season. The flowers come and go, and they have a real role and a place in it, but it's foliage that my eye goes to. And then I thought that the garden needed to offer a variety of experiences, and there are all these great long views, but there should also be arresting visual moments within the garden. And then it really needs to be a country garden. There are straight lines, there are some hedges, but it's mostly a garden of relaxed, sensuous curves, and it's exuberant. And I wanted it to be informed and enchanting and never complete. It shouldn't stand still. It needs to evolve and to be interesting in all seasons. And then the garden's designed and maintained according to ecological principles and sustainability as I understand them. And I said that I want to enhance habitat for wildlife, and that the vegetable garden is entirely organic. And then, I mean, the main purpose of the garden is for my own well-being, my own health and well-being, and the pleasure of working in it and being outside and absorbed in the natural world. Um, but I wanted to reflect my enthusiasm, and I want to share it. And I want to be able to have an emotional life in the garden, and I'm happy if others can express or feel a certain emotion when they visit the garden. So I want to quickly jump into the flower garden and a couple of other spots, but this is Northcote, Stephen Parrish's garden. I said that I learned a lot here, and one of the things that I learned is that he called this his flower garden, and it had trees and shrubs and cutback trees and cutback shrubs and vines and roses and hedges and hardy perennials, half-hardy perennials, annuals, biennials, bulbs. So I took this approach. I think I also really absorbed a lot of Ellen Shipman's gardens and her work. She had redesigned the flower garden at the St. Gaudens place, and she was really interested in creating a garden with visual interest while that site was open from the public from Memorial Day to Columbus Day. And I think that's my goal, is to have a flower garden that has a long season of interest. And I've also incorporated those conifers and cutback shrubs and a variety of perennials, bulbs, some annuals, not as many as I used to. Now we're just going to take a quick skip through the seasons. When in early May, when the pruning is done, there are many cutback shrubs here that need tending early on. And then in late May is the first burst of flower bloom, with the allium, purple sensation, and camassia coming up out of all the fresh foliage of conifers and shrubs and perennials. And then into June, it becomes more of a traditional northern New England flower garden with bearded iris and Siberian iris and heucheras and geraniums and lychnis and Sarah Bernhardt peonies. And then by early July, there's some early phloxes and Karl Forster, some of the great German hybrid delphinium that do well here, and continuing into July with hollyhocks from some of the Cornish gardens and phloxes dug out of many of the Cornish gardens. There are Phlox paniculata in bloom in this garden, different varieties from the 1st of July and into the first week or so of October. And I've worked really hard to focus on the late summer interest in the garden, and the Joe Pyeweed and phloxes and monardas help with that. The New England asters and grasses. And then into October, the fading stems of the perennials and the more saturated colors of the shrubs keep the garden going. So we step out of the garden into the base of the barn foundation, and this is a part of the garden that was made. This is the second iteration of this garden. I first planted a collection of summer blooming phlox here, and it was just the wrong thing to do. So I needed to, when you're walking out of the flower garden, you don't want to see more phlox. You want to have a different experience. And this is at a time when a lot of people were planting bananas and cannas and really focused on a tropical effect in gardens. And I've been able to do that with regersias and euphorbias and Himalayan rhubarbs and darmaris and various cutback willows. And you can also leave the garden and come up to the barn, and in June, the east side of the barn is covered with bloom from the climbing hydrangea, which is alive with pollinators for weeks at a time. And then there's spring interest behind the barn where it's cooler, the soil is deeper and richer, and trilliums and early bronze regersias are the focus. And then in June, some of the more special collectors plants and some of the Ito peonies and Meconopsis take center stage. And then we step up to the barn foundation with more of the Himalayan rhubarb, and into the milking parlor with its collection of phloxes and pulsatillas in May, and then in June with a variety of thymes and sedums, and a collection of troughs from Stonecrop Garden that is a home for some of the gardens, some of the plants that just won't thrive in these flat surfaces, especially saxifrages and Primula marginatas, and a shaded area under some adjoining apples with its tiarellas and primulas, epimediums and anemonellas. Sorry. And then if one rock garden wasn't enough, I found below the deck a really cooler, moister spot that that some of the saxifrages and campanulas and androsaces and gentians and daphnes and epimediums really love. So you've seen the stable. We're going to now leave the stable, walk out to the north past the ginkgo in October into one of the newer areas of the garden. A part of the garden it took me a long time to come to, because I just wasn't sure whether adding this part of the garden might sort of tip the balance and take away from the enjoyment of the place. But I wanted to experiment with a lot of the perennials that Pete Aldoff and other garden designers are working now, and to test perennials that for their use as pollinator plants, and as a part of the garden that maybe requires a little bit less maintenance. And it's a part of the garden too that I can leave alone in the fall and really enjoy late fall and into the winter. And this takes me up to part of the garden called Silver and Gold, inspired by the great dogwood, the variegated dogwood that you see in the upper left, called Silver and Gold, and with many cutback shrubs, elderberries and willows and silvery willows, silvery grasses and eryngiums, and robinia, freesia. And this is the part of the garden too where I've learned from Fergus Garrett at Great Dixter how to incorporate early spring bloom, especially narcissus, under shrubs. And it wouldn't be a New England garden without a fall display of asters and some aconites and a new interest in Korean maples. So that's our walk through the garden, walk to the view, and to the end of this slide presentation. So thank you for your attention, and I'll see if we can get into some questions and answers.
That was wonderful, Bill. Thank you. I realized I was smiling the whole time.
Thank you. I could see you. Thank you.
I can't imagine what it feels like to be there when, when everything's blooming. I could really use that right now, I think, on this chilly winter day. So does anyone have a question to start us off?
Well, I'm curious about the deer and critter control around the plants.
Okay. Deer.
Deer, yeah.
We'll start with deer. We'll start with deer. They're here. They're really here right now. There are 7 very hungry deer that are here every day. I've learned that, well, first of all, there's some things that I just don't plant. Mm-hmm. That are going to take too much protection for deer, rhododendrons, for instance, but also my soil does not have the pH for rhododendrons, so that's not a big deal. But those conifers that you saw, they all get protected with wire netting or deer netting in mid-November, and then it's removed in mid-spring. So fencing and netting and the combination for evergreens and yuccas and things like that. And then, they're now eating hellebores and epimediums. They usually don't eat hellebores and epimediums in this garden, but this year they're eating hellebores and epimediums. But in the summer, they pretty much stay away from the flower garden, or if they're around, a little bit of spray, usually only once or twice will deter them. They go up through the far end of the garden and they nibble hydrangeas and all sorts of things on their way. And if I spray, I spray. If I don't get to it, I just lose it. Woodchucks and voles are the other critters, and they just have to be dealt with.
Karen, I think you have a question, but you're on mute. There you go.
I just used a couple of times the term cutback shrubs. And Bill, when do you decide when they get too large, or is it something you do routinely?
It's something I do routinely. If I call it a cutback shrub, it's something I do routinely. And the cutback shrubs in the flower garden are mostly panicle hydrangeas and willows. And then in other gardens, people treat smoke bush and other plants as cutback shrubs. And well, I also have I have had Paulownia and Catalpa. And without getting into all of the technical horticultural aspects of it, what I do is cut those back hard in late winter to where I know buds will form and in the spring and summer. So you saw in some of those pictures sort of a big globular willow. I cut that back to about 4 or 5 feet and 4 or 5 main stems coming off of that. And I'll get 5, 6 feet of growth in that willow through the summer.
One season. Interesting. Thank you.
We have a question I was also wondering about. Do you have a staff to help with the gardens?
I was running short of time, so I skipped mentioning my staff. I don't have a staff. I have a colleague, Susan Howard, who has worked with me in this garden every Friday since 1996. So the garden is also largely hers. She doesn't want to take any credit for it, but what she brings to it that I don't is a really thorough and fine sense of pruning and grooming and sort of an exhaustive approach to making plants perform the way we would like them to and to work with one another the way we would like them to. Sue, as a business, she's a designer and she also maintains gardens, and she's brilliant. And then we used to mow the lawn. We no longer mow the lawn. There's some very good arborists that will work, sometimes half a day, sometimes a full day in the winter, and sometimes a half a day in the summer.
Have you ever tried to grow lavender in New Hampshire?
I grow it pretty successfully in the rock garden.
Mhm.
So much so that it's seeding itself around in those crevices in the cracks of the milking parlor. I have a fairly heavy soil, so there aren't many spots in the garden where I can grow it, but I also grow a number of plants in containers on the deck, which I don't show pictures of. And I love growing lavender in containers on the deck. And then I store it over the winter in a cool basement. And sometimes I lose it. Most times I'll get a couple of years, 2-3 years out of it.
In the same planter,
In the same planter, yes.
it'll come back.
Come see, come saw.
Mm.
Okay.
No guarantees.
Mhm. What's your approach to watering?
Dragging hose. And the goal is not to water the garden beyond, in the stretches beyond the flower garden. So I'm still redoing some spots out there. So I have hoses out there for newly planted plants. But the goal is to water as little as possible, and you know, shrubs help with that.
Mm. Beautiful.
Thank you.
And then I would just ask, what about weeding? I mean, I know you plant stuff closely to keep some of it down, but there still have to be a whole lot of sort of volunteers that you would rather not.
Well, along the edges of beds, yes, there's grass moving in, and there are weeds. So yes, there's a lot of weeding. Yeah.
So, and is that something you do as meditation, or do you have some
Mhm.
neighborhood adolescent who you're teaching a good work ethic, or supporting a good work ethic for?
I do it with sort of an angry point of view, so it's not meditation.
Yeah.
Sue brings a much more yoga style to weeding than I do, but you know, I have a scuffle hoe, and I just love using the scuffle hoe.
Scuffle hoe. That's one of those things you push down? I mean,
Help me. What's the other name for scuffle hoe? It's a stirrup. A stirrup hoe is the other name. It's a
oh,
stirrup.
okay.
and it
Now I
put-
know what you mean. Yeah.
and it toggles back and forth. So
Yeah.
I mean, I learned about that when I was farming, and you know, that's what I use in the vegetable garden, and then I'll use it around the edges of the flower gardens.
It's sometimes just hard to know how to do anything creative if you can't get ahead of the weeds. You know what I mean? You have to,
Yeah, I mean, we've
you know that.
we've got weeds. We've got, you know, bishop's weed wanting to put itself around, and chickweeds and various grasses and so forth. But for now, it's part of what we do.
And in your garden, you might have your garden kind of trained, you know, so it knows what not to pull on somebody like you. Just a thought. Just a thought.
It wouldn't be interesting if that the day after we had just done a really fine job pruning the sugar maple in the front, that, you know, a third of it just collapsed. So,
Oh, geez.
yeah, there's always got to be something.
Yeah.
Do you mulch your garden?
Well, I use pea stone as mulch in the rock gardens and in the front of the house, where I have some areas that I didn't show you. And then I like using chopped leaves in the fall to put on beds. And I don't have enough to put everywhere every year, but I kind of have a rotation to keep ahead with the flower gardens and the beds around the barn. And I don't think I have bought in mulch in a decade or more.
Hmm.
We have a question about starting an apple orchard, if you have any recommendations about how to begin with that.
Well, make sure that you know your soil can support apples. I was just looking at someone wanting to establish an orchard, and they had a really wonderful place picked out. But I think we determined that the soils were too wet, too heavy. They flooded occasionally. That the deer browse was going to be so intense in that location that a really good fence was going to be needed. So instead we found a place a little closer to the house, a little drier, a little better location where the air drained. So there are a lot of considerations about soil and air drainage, and then protection from voles and field mice and deer. I see a question. Let's see what. So what are the upright wooden posts around the edge of the bed on the front? Those are so that's the vegetable garden, and then there is a fence around that. There's a turkey wire fence, and I chose the turkey wire because you don't really see it from a distance. And those are 6-inch square cedar posts that I found at a fence company that were left over from a job, and they are replacing rounded cedar posts that had lasted about 20 years that were also left over from a job at that same place.
Hmm.
And they're buried in crushed rock, and they need to be reset every spring after the freeze thaw action. And I can get most of them to stand up straight, but not the ones in the back. So they didn't show up in the photograph.
Hmm.
That's great.
I have a question.
Yes.
I planted a lot of roses and the deer ate them all. So I heard that you could hang soap on them. I tried everything and it seemed like they're down to like a foot high. They ate them all of them. What do you do with that?
Not knowing where you are and just how much deer browse there is and the size of the herd and the frequency that they visit. Either give up on roses, fence, I mean, I'm sure other people have other experiences. But there are probably also other roses that are, if you're growing tea roses or some of the new hybrids that aren't prickly, you're more susceptible to deer browse.
What are your plans for the garden this coming season? Are you making any changes or expanding or?
That's a good question. What I do is I keep a sort of a running series of notes in a Word document on the computer. And so Sue and I go through the garden in the fall before the end of the season and make notes about what we want to do, and anything that we want to move is tagged. And there are no big projects for this year. This year is about fine tuning. And so my goal is with fine tuning, with moving shrubs, and I've also got a little bit of a holding bed nursery. And so what I do is I grow plants that come from the nursery. I grow them onto a size where I can move them into the garden. And so I like to do that by the end of April. So that's my plan for this year. I'm also going to open the garden this year, and so I don't want to do any big renovations. And there are a couple of things coming on down the line, but I'm not ready to tackle them yet.
Will that be part of the open days through the Garden Conservancy?
Yeah, right now we're hoping to open the garden on July 10th, I believe it is, Saturday, July 10th. And the Garden Conservancy will be announcing something at some point. I'm not sure when. They've just been in touch to see that I'm still willing to open the garden, and it's going to be a different, reservation system and so forth. But the plan is to open the garden to the public one day in July.
That's great.
Yeah.
Do you have issues with bittersweet?
No, I don't. There was no bittersweet nearby. So, I mean, none of the gardeners nearby had planted bittersweet. So it hasn't seeded in around here. Honeysuckle is the front of the house and has seeded around. That's the main woody weed, but I have some equisetum, some horsetail, mare's tail moving into the flower garden out front, and but luckily no real woody pests in the rest of the garden.
Wonderful.
We have
Now
time.
I'm sorry it's January, because now I really want to get outside. Beautiful.
I'm with you there.
We have time for one or two more questions. Does anyone else have a question or a comment?
Where do you get your plants? Where do you buy them at nurseries that are local, or do you order them online, from here and there?
Well, one of the great things about working for the Garden Conservancy was that I traveled throughout the country. And so I was able to visit nurseries, especially in the Pacific Northwest and in North Carolina, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Southern Connecticut. So I was able to buy real plants from real people. I go to the plant sale at Hollister House Garden during Garden Study Weekend, because there are some really first-rate New England growers who go there and sell. I just put in an order to Digging Dog Nursery in California, Joy Creek Nursery in Oregon, and Edelweiss Nursery in Oregon are some of my go-to mail order nurseries right now. And a lot of people are hesitant to order from mail order nurseries, especially on the West Coast. I have, with those three nurseries, I have the best possible luck. They plants that no one on the East Coast sells, and they're good quality plants, and they perform really well here. I mean, I don't order Zone 7 plants,
Right.
but I'll order Zone 5 and some Zone 6 perennials, because a lot of the West Coasters don't know about Zone 4, so they just say, Zone 6. But I was really lucky to be able to be making the garden 20 years ago, when there were many more specialty nurseries to choose from.
Wow.
Is there anybody you're particularly crazy about in, this part of Connecticut or Massachusetts or New York that you could mention?
Sure. Broken Arrow in Hamden.
Yeah.
Well, Ed Bowen, Issima Nursery, it used to be Opus in Rhode Island. They do some mail order. And you're going to laugh, but in the Hudson Valley, what is it? Adams, Farracker's Farm.
Yeah,
You know, early in the, I used to live in Cold Spring. I worked in Cold Spring, and early in the season, you would find some really interesting plants show up. Not many,
yeah.
but really, so really interesting. And I guess maybe I mentioned that because, the more people ask for the interesting plants and buy them at places like that, the more
The more
they'll
they're gonna
become
stock them.
available.
I think they've got a design and installation business in that. I'm sure that's part of a reflection of that.
Yeah.
Adams. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Huh.
When
Bay State perennials in Hadley or Deerfield is good too.
you referred to a sale at Hollister House, when does that take place?
Well, in the age of COVID, I can't say. We were discussing that at Hollister House this afternoon. Garden Study Weekend has always taken place the Saturday after Labor Day. I'm not sure what the date is going to be this year, and I'm not sure that there will be a plant sale with it this year. But certainly by the following year, we'll be back, in full business. And Stonecrop Gardens in Cold Spring, so that's not all that far from you, has a really good sale of alpine plants and other shrubs, conifers, the third Saturday of April. But again, I don't know whether they'll be having that sale this year.
Sure.
That's great.
Yeah.
Well, that's really wonderful, Bill. Thank you so much. It was a wonderful, wonderful thing to do. It's very chilly here. I'm chilly. I'm not usually chilly here in my attic, but it's actually chilly up here tonight. So it was
All
so
right, so time.
no, but a wonderful thing on a winter evening to dream about spring and what the possibilities are for us coming up. So thank you so much. We really
Excellent.
appreciate it. Again, everyone, thank you all for your support. Thank you for joining us. And if you'd like a copy of the book, again,
It is
contact
really,
us tomorrow.
yeah.
Holly's at the library right now. And
I'll throw one out the window to you. I mean, they're just really, it is a spectacularly beautiful book. Really nice.
so thank you again so much. And we hope to see you in the library or on Zoom again soon. So stay well, everybody. Thank you.
Thank